Thank you for the very wonderful introduction. I'm really honored to be here. And I am interested today in kind of give you a snapshot of what my forthcoming book is about. So actually, before I begin, I want to kind of preface by suggesting that this project is actually a response to two different sets of historiographical problems. And I'm framing them as problems in the sense that I think they are in tension with one another. I was just actually attending a conference at Yale a few days ago on rethinking the history of sexology. So it's really interesting because the history of sexual science is such an abundant, there's such an abundant literature on the topic. So that's a question of abundance. But on the other hand, as you'll see, some of the examples I'll be talking about, especially in the history of queer sexuality and trans theory, China is decisively absent. So that's a question of absence, right? So this is a project that in some ways is trying to make an intervention to reconcile that tension. And hopefully today I'll be able to convince you how that can work. So the book, After Eunuchs, Science, Medicine, and the Transformation of Sex in Modern China, is drawn from my PhD dissertation. So it's a project that I've been working on for over a decade. I'm glad that it's finally coming out in this summer. And the bulk of the narrative deals with, starts with the demise of castration and eunuchs in the late 19th century. And it concludes with the 1950s emergence of transsexuality, sex reassignment surgeries. So I begin with the ending of a historical era, that is with the demise of castration eunuchs, and I conclude with the social origins of a new historical epoch, so to speak. So today I'll be giving you three particular examples. And before I go into the three examples, I want to kind of go over the conceptual and visual history of sex as a background into some of these examples. So the first example that I'll be talking about is the global perception of eunuchs and castration in the late 19th century. The second example that I'll be talking about is a highly sensationalized case of female to male transformation in 1930s Shanghai. And the third example, the last example I'll be talking about is the so-called the first Chinese transsexual that was widely reported in the Taiwanese media in the 1950s. So those will be my three examples that anchor my discussion. And as you'll see, what I'm suggesting here is that, by focusing on a phenomenon as marginal as sex reassignment or sex change, we'll see that over the course of this period of history that I'll be talking about, we're also looking at broader shifts in Chinese geopolitics. So it's kind of, rethinking about how we can contextualize the history of the self by mapping the history of biopolitics onto the history of geopolitics. And I think by talking about the history of the self in the Chinese context, it raises different sets of issues if we're to look at this history, let's say in the European or North American context. Okay, so let me begin. So I don't assume that everyone can read Chinese here, but so you'll have to kind of take my word for it. And basically, I'm showing this slide because when I was starting to do research for the project, I was looking at publications that came out in the first decade of the 20th century. And I was really surprised by the finding that our modern Chinese word for sex, which is 性, actually doesn't appear in any of the titles. Right? And so these are actually not just random books that I was looking at. These are books that focus on love, reproductive health, marriage, so on and so forth. So the word 性, the Chinese word for sex, actually doesn't appear in any of the titles that came out in the first decade of the 20th century. So that's kind of my first question mark, right? So how is the word 性 came to be equated with this idea of sex? And so my project is going to respond to that. This is not entirely new in the sense that other sinologists have already made a claim that before the 20th century, actually the Chinese word for sex, xing, didn't really mean sex. And so this kind of builds on these other people's work, Frank Decoder, Judy Farquhar, San Zilan, Leon Rochat, and others as well. Just to add kind of a footnote here, if we were to look at a Chinese dictionary today, if we were to flip through a Chinese dictionary today and look up for the word xing in it, we will actually see many different definitions, right? So they include natural instinct, inherent tendencies, temperament, the nature of something or someone, even life. Okay, so all of these definitions of xing, you will be able to see at least one, but there's many classical corresponding Chinese sources. It is when we get to the definition of xing as sex that we do not find a corresponding classical Chinese source. So that goes some way to, again, address what I was saying earlier, that what we mean by xing today actually didn't mean so before 20th century. And so how do we explain this? I'm going to skip some parts of the PowerPoint in the interest of time, but from a purely etymological perspective, I think one of the most important and interesting explanations has been that it was in an era of colonial modernity and the rise of Japanese imperialism. In the late 19th century, Japanese intellectuals and writers began to use classical Chinese characters to translate Western neologisms, European neologisms. And so xing was appropriated in this context by Japanese writers to translate sex. These characters would then be imported back into China with a radical change in meaning. So this is actually what literary scholar Lydia Liu has called return graphic loans. So these characters would then be imported back into China with a complete different set of meanings. So xing was part of this translational trajectory. Another example that I like to bring up as part of this translational trajectory is, which is relevant to our study here, is the word science. So the modern word for science is actually 科学. And what 科学 meant before the 20th century was 科 refers to 科举, which is the civil service examination system, and 学 refers to learning. So before 20th century, 科学 really meant the study and preparation for the civil exam. It was only after the early 20th century that it became systematized as a translation for science. So keeping that in mind, I like to shift our focus a little bit from an etymological perspective to my method. The method that I adopt in the book is following the French tradition of historical epistemology, and it's really to look at the conditions that had to be established in order for this concept of xing to become equated with the notion of sex. So what I'm interested in is to look at the key epistemic nodal points around which what we talk about as sex today came to be consolidated. I think my thesis is quite simple. It is simply that the modern formulation of xing as sex relies on the new structures of knowledge that emerged in the early 20th century. And as I'll show, these structures of knowledge were consolidated around the visual realm, the realm of human desire, and most importantly, this new sense that the human body, the physical human body, and not just psychological, is malleable and mutable. And we'll see how the introduction of scientific ideas help to solidify that. So specifically, I'm looking at ideas from biology, sexology, and endocrinology, how the introduction of these new scientific ideas changed the way Chinese people thought about the human body. Okay, so as a kind of a background, in the mid-19th century, as it is well known, the urban center of Chinese culture and society gradually shifted from the heartland to coastal China, right? So this is the context in which places such as Tianjin, such as Shanghai, emerged as the new cosmopolitan centers of China. So why is that? I mean, the typical explanation has been, the opening up of China through the Opium Wars, but there's also very important nativist and domestic reasons for it. For instance, the Daoguang Emperor experimented the transportation of grain not through the Grand Canal because there is a lot of flooding issues around Yellow River, but he experimented with the route through the sea route, right? So this is where you see the center of urban Chinese culture gradually shifted from the Grand Canal-based cities to coastal cities such as Shanghai and Tianjin. So it's a combination of these factors. So that's the historical context in which medical missionaries coming from Europe, coming from the United States, began to establish a presence. And so Benjamin Hobson was one of the first medically qualified medical missionary coming to China in the mid-19th century. And he was very important because he produced perhaps the first systematic anatomical treatise that introduced Western biomedical ideas about the body to China and Chinese public. So what I'm showing here are, and I should warn you that I'll be showing you quite a lot of very graphic images. And this is taken from his 全体新论, a new treatise on anatomy that was published in 1851. So it is not a case that before the 19th century, Chinese doctors had no sense of Western anatomy whatsoever. But it is the case that it is gradually from this point onward, from mid-19th century onward, that the translation of Western biomedical understandings of the body became much more systematic. And so this is taken from his new treatise on anatomy, and where we see there's illustrations, graphic illustrations of male reproductive anatomy. And there's also corresponding illustrations for female reproductive anatomy. So I'm showing these to the extent that they might not seem very surprising or striking to us in the contemporary period, but it was surprising in the mid-19th century because before that point, Chinese medical understandings of the body had not systematically established a one-to-one correspondence between specific anatomical concepts and a specific locus of the human body. So you can see that this is really a new endeavor in that sense. And I do want to kind of show you a quick comparison of the kind of difference that I'm talking about here. So now I'm comparing Hobson's anatomical drawing of the body on the left-hand side with a drawing from a classical Chinese medical text. It's actually taken from Huangdi Neijing, one of the most important classical Chinese medical texts. And so again, this goes some way to dispel the myth that before the 19th century, Chinese medicine had no sense of the anatomy of the body. But I think what we're seeing here is a striking difference in the kind of claims being made, right, about the body. In fact, we would not, for instance, want to perform surgeries on the body based on the illustration on the right-hand side, right? Because that is a map kind of off the body, map to the body. Sorry, I confused that. But whereas Hobson's illustration is map of the body because it relies on a very concrete sense of kind of death and closure. And in fact, I would argue this is where we start to see a certain sense of visual objectivity, right? Because the distance between the organs are actually exact. It also relies on the exact location, not just of organ, but also the distance between the viewer and the image. This is where the kind of visual illustrations of Western anatomy start to stake a new kind of epistemological claim. So I just want to put that out there to show what I'm calling the anatomical aesthetics of medicine starting to emerge in the mid-19th century. That is starting to challenge the older traditional Chinese medical conceptualizations of the body. And as you see, once you get to the May 4th period, by the 1920s and 1930s, these anatomical illustrations of the body were actually even domesticated by native Chinese intellectuals themselves. In addition to anatomy, Chinese biologists also circulated illustrations of sex on the level of morphology. So this technique of visualization is drawing on a long-standing tradition in natural history that suggests you can understand an organism based on morphology, right? So in addition to anatomy, there's morphology, and so here's more examples of that coming from a very well-known authority in Chinese biology, Zhu Xi. This came out in the 1940s, and I would actually argue that by that point, I'll come back to this, there's a more new technique of visualization. But all of this depictions of the body came about during the time in which the human body was compared to a machine. So, historian Dorothy Ko has talked about this as a very important background for the rise of anti-foot binding movement in China. But you can see the human body is actually compared very specific to the mechanical metaphor. For instance, the human digestive system is now compared to a factory, and the human eye is compared to a camera. So this is a very distinctive kind of mechanical illustration of the body. So that's the kind of context I want to draw your attention to, in which this new understanding of the human body is emerging. And so here comes my third kind of technique of visualization that I'm examining here. And that is, by the 1940s, Chinese biologists were really well-versed in the sophisticated theories of sex determination that absorbed Western geneticists in the early 20th century, right? So it's not just a matter of anatomy. It's not just a matter of how male and female organisms looked in terms of morphology, but now the seat of sexual difference, or in fact sexual determination, as we'll see, is actually now located on the level beneath the cell, right? It is through this macroscopic gaze, clinical gaze, that we can start to understand the actual secret of sexual difference. Okay, so having established that visual kind of conceptual history of sex, I want to go right into my first example, and that is the global perception of eunuchs in the late 19th century. One of the reasons that I started working on this project was because I was kind of surprised by the fact that we all know eunuchs played a very important role in Chinese dynastic history. And in fact, there's a lot of work on Chinese eunuchs in history, but they tend to focus on their political involvement in the state. So if Chinese eunuchs were so important historically, how come historians have not focused on their body experience? Specifically, we actually don't know a lot about how Chinese eunuchs were made. And so that was actually the tipping point for me. That was the starting point for me in launching this project. I wanted to know about the Chinese castration operations. I wanted to know how Chinese eunuchs were made and transformed into eunuchs. And I was actually quite surprised, for instance, to find that we don't actually have a lot of textual record about Chinese castration. That started to change again by the mid to late 19th century. And this is kind of where the parallel between the demise of castration and the rise of the anti-foot binding movement have some kind of striking similarity. So specifically, what I discovered was that there emerged an abundance of textual, oral, and visual sources about Chinese castration operations. And there are three voices specifically that contributed to the making of this archive. One is Western spectators. So from the late 19th century onward, you see a lot of Western doctors talking about Chinese castration. And again, I'll show some graphic images coming from their writings and publications. The second important source is actually from eunuchs themselves, their self-narration. From the late 19th century onward, people became much more interested in what eunuchs had to say. Of course, this had a lot to do with the demise of the Qing dynasty as well. But thirdly, the last royal family's member imperial family's members, such as Puyi and his brother and cousin, and his relative contributed to the kind of sealing of the fate of the demise of castration. So these were three distinct voices that contributed to the making of this archive. And what is actually striking for me was that these voices began to expose the Chinese castrated body, right? This kind of motif of exposure goes against the very reason of existence of these cultural practices. Because something like foot binding and castration relies on notions of concealment, right? It's concealing the body that gave foot binding and castration its cultural survival, its reason for existence, because they're connected to Chinese notion of civility and culture. So you can see that the turning of the body inside out, first by Western spectators, but eventually by Chinese themselves, kind of sealed the fate for the demise of castration. And this had a lot to do, I'll come back to this in some of the slides later, the rise of medical photography around the world, but also certain notions about China that began to be consolidated in the 19th century, right? So for instance, as we know, in the 19th century, China domesticated or borrowed the notion of segment of Asia from the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, over the course of the 19th century, China would be increasingly blamed to be the home of some of these diseases: bubonic plague, cholera, smallpox, and eventually leprosy. In fact, eventually syphilis as well. If you're familiar with the kind of Asian American discourse about connecting Chineseness with syphilis, that disease was connected with China or Chineseness too. So this relies on certain kind of both conceptual, epistemological, and what I'm saying, visual connection between what we call China and conceptions of illness and pathology. Okay, so just keep that, what I said in mind. I think that can help us appreciate what we're looking at here in this slide. The image on the left-hand side here, the photograph of a eunuch, is taken from a medical publication that came out in 1894. The author is Jean-Jacques Matignon, who was the physician to the French legation in Beijing. We don't really know how he got this photograph. We don't really know who the eunuch is. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is the genre in which this image appeared. So this appeared in a medical publication. So it's actually presenting us here of a Chinese castrated, Chinese eunuch's body as an example of Chinese pathology, right? So what I'm suggesting here is that now we're not just looking at what is pathological ill about this eunuch's body, but what is wrong with China itself, right? It's through this kind of double move that allows us to see how China was granted gradually into the system of nation states, with a growing intensity being racially stereotyped as a segment of Asia. So how do we kind of evaluate the legacy of this post-colonial modernity? And I like to, again, compare two sets of photographs of eunuchs to kind of really bring out that difference. On the left-hand side is actually medical photographs of eunuchs again, coming from a medical publication in the 1930s. On the right-hand side, you're seeing here is eunuchs, photographs of eunuchs found in the Chiang Palace archive. Again, I think what they are, how they are representing eunuch's body is, again, very telling in terms of their differences. On the right-hand side there, the eunuch's body is naked. It's anonymous. The eunuchs can only be identified with their specimen number. And in fact, I think the viewer is made kind of less guilt-driven by the kind of anonymity that we're seeing here, presented through the image, right? So it's a clinical gaze, and it's clinical as well as a colonial kind of spectatorship. But when we turn to the pictures of eunuchs on the right-hand side here, coming from the Qing Palace archives, in the Qing Palace archive, we have a very distinct sense of who these eunuchs are, how old they are, where they're from, and what their role is in the court, right, in the palace. So in some ways, and they're staring at us, and they're not lacking kind of sense of agency or subjectivity, right? So what that means is that they are representing some kind of a native population, right? Not waiting for the need of Western assistance or Western biomedical assistance, right? Again, the background here is also important. Of course, I would agree with the arguments that eunuchs also operate within a certain kind of gender heteronormative system in place, and in fact patriarchal system in place. But just as a kind of lateral comparison here between the Western medical images and the Qing Palace images, you can see that we're looking at colonial modernity at work. So I have a few more images that I'd like to share with you. This is actually an image of the last surviving Chinese eunuch, Sun Yaoting, who passed away in 1996. Sun Yaoting was interviewed by his biographer on the right, Jia Yinghua. So the biography of Sun Yaoting, I think, was translated into English at one point. So this is in some ways made available to a global audience, can learn about Sun Yaoting's life. He is also in this picture, right in the middle there. This is Sun Yaoting. And this photo is interesting, extent that it was taken in 1958. This is the last, as far as I'm aware of, the last effort of the Chinese government to unify the surviving old eunuchs in China. And not all of them are eunuchs. Some of them are Buddhist monks or people working in temples. But this was nevertheless the last effort to do that. And the eunuchs were interviewed, and their life histories were kind of transcribed, and I think they were probably even translated into English as well. I'm not sure about that. But that the self-narration of eunuchs from that point were in some ways made available to a much wider audience. This is on the right-hand side here, is actually a preface written by Sun Yaoting himself, introducing the book, the biography. And here you have Pu Jie, who was Pu Yi's brother, endorsing the biography, saying that this is a very important historical document. All right, so that is going to conclude the first example, how you go from Western spectators' perception or their claims about China's place in the world through their pathologization of eunuchs, but that some of these narratives were then eventually reinforced by the self-narration of eunuchs themselves. I need to go over this section really quickly because it's kind of in the interest of time. But I just want to gesture to the fact that in the aftermath of the May 4th movement in the 1920s and 1930s, in urban China, there was a very systematic effort among some of the intellectuals to establish a field in sexology. So Zhang Jingshen and Pan Guangdan were two well-known Chinese sexologists. They interviewed, they collected the kind of life stories of people's kind of sex lives as data for their scientific studies. They also translated foreign sexological texts. And as you'll see, they also established learned societies in sexology and founded journals such as the Sex Magazine and Sex Science. They also greeted high-profile sexologists from Europe, such as here we're seeing is Magnus Hirschfeld visiting China, giving a talk to the Chinese Women's Association in the 1930s. So there was a very distinct effort to give the notion of Xing a carnal and subjective dimension. I want to move on to talking about, why May 4th? I think to some extent, it was the intellectual environment for kind of iconoclastic effort to challenge Confucian understandings of love and intimacy. So, for instance, this is also a context in which there was the science and the debate over science and life. So this is to give science a new sense of kind of modernist look, right, impulse. So in their work, by collecting the data of people's sex lives, they're saying that this way of narrating people's intimacy should take precedent, right? This is going to challenge the traditional vehicle, including literature, poetry, so on and so forth, in which people's intimacy and love life were narrated. So in some ways, this new mode, this new regime of truthhood is to replace the earlier regime of narration of intimacy. So I think it has to do with that kind of intellectual effort to challenge earlier Confucianist understandings of love and sex. So I want to kind of move on to talk about my second example, and that is to see how the mutability of the human body came about. So in addition to establishing the visuality of sex, I've been suggesting earlier that the demise of castration indexed the birth of the concept of sex itself. In addition to visuality, in addition to intimacy and carnality, what was very interesting is, from the 1930s onward, Chinese sexologists also established a new notion of sex as a mutable essence of the human body. So in this context, first, they were really interested in the idea of hormones. And hormones provided Chinese commentators a new language to talk about the relationship between the human body and gender norms. They stopped to draw on the notion of anatomical sexes that were important, descending from the May 4th era of feminism, and start to entertain the idea that at base, everyone, all humans, are equivalent. There's a universal human body, what they call the theory of bisexuality. So this theory of universal bisexuality does not refer to sexual orientation in the way we understand today, but refers to biological constitution of sex. So what endocrinologists discovered in the 1920s and 1930s was that everyone had both male and female sex hormones. So this actually, for those of you who are familiar with European intellectual history, around the turn of the century, especially in Viennese intellectual circles, Sigmund Freud, Otto Weininger, there were already theories of universal bisexuality that challenged the Victorian notion of antagonist sex. But that circulated primarily in the psychoanalytic literature. In the endocrinological literature, what it provided was a new biological evidence for this theory of universal bisexuality, so that males and females were simply idealized polarity versions of human body that did not exist in reality, but everyone falls somewhere in between. So they rely on the language of hormones, the theory of bisexuality, to rethink some of the older traditional examples of reproductive anomalies. So you can see that these are very kind of complicated and kind of sophisticated new notions of sex and sex change. So they relied they drew on the examples of eunuchs in this context, but also hermaphrodite bodies to kind of grasp this new language of hormones and bisexuality, and to rethink what it might mean to think about humans as potential agents of sex transformation. Now, there's another layer of background lurking here that I haven't talked about, and that is in the early 20th century, European scientists such as Eugene Sinek, on the right-hand side you can see there of his photo, they were famous for experimenting sex change on animals, right? So they transplanted male gonads into female animals and vice versa, and observe the masculinization of female animals, female rats, guinea pigs, and vice versa, the feminization of male animals. So people were aware of these transplantation surgeries. People were aware that it's possible to change sex, at least among animals. And up to this point, what I'm suggesting is that Chinese intellectuals also entertained the possibility of same-sex change, but they thought that it was only possible for anomalies, right, such as eunuchs or hermaphrodites. And as we'll see, I'll show you that started to change with a very famous case of sex transformation in the 1930s. I just want to draw your attention that in the 1930s, they also reported on the case of the Danish girl, Lily Alp, in the Chinese press. So this sex change, animals or humans, were high on people's radar, right? And not just within the scientific circle. And one of the arguments I'm making here is that, it's through these popular press's accounts of sex change that complicated ideas from the scientific elite discourses gradually get filtered into a more popular lexicon. So all of this changed, I believe, with the case of female-to-male transformation that was widely reported in urban China in the mid-1930s. And that is the case of Yao Jinping, a lady from Tianjin who came forward in the summer of 1935, claimed that she has been converted into a man overnight. And so the story goes that the family actually lost contact with Yao Jinping's father. So Yao was very disappointed, depressed, and she cried day and night until a lightning struck the roof of their house in the summer of 1934. And suddenly, he felt change. She felt change to her body. And she reported her sex change, alleged sex change, to her grandparents who verified in a strategic way of her sex change. So they decided to bring Yao to her father's General Li Du. I believe I have a photo of him here. General Li Du, who was actually very important in defending China in the context of the Sino-Japanese War. But anyway, Yao Jinping presented herself to Li Du saying that, I want to be able to join the army now that I'm a man. So that was the kind of rationale and the story presented to the press. Her grandfather initially took the initiative to explain the whole case to journalists and reporters. And he showed a lot of different kind of evidence to support the fact that she has transformed into a man. And this was one of the evidence, the photos of her sex change both before and after. And this was circulated in many of the newspapers that reported on Yao's case. So Li Du was actually very surprised by this, and so he immediately consulted medical authorities about the case. So even before the physical exam of Yao Jinping took place, many doctors actually went directly to Yao Jinping or surmised about the reasoning behind her sex change. So I won't go into that in the interest of time, but I just want to highlight that Yan Fuqing, the head of the National Shanghai Medical College, was perhaps the most important authority to weigh in, to chime in on this case. And Yan Fuqing, like others, initially explained Yao Jinping's sex change in terms of pseudo-hermaphroditism. So the idea is that pseudo-hermaphrodites may change their sex as one gets older. So that was the initial reasoning. But he was really surprised by the fact that Yao claimed that she had changed sex abruptly overnight. That doesn't happen with pseudo-hermaphroditic sex changes. So Yan assigned 6 of his best doctors to the case, 2 Western doctors and 4 Chinese doctors. And they tried to persuade Yao to disrobe so that they could perform a physical exam on her body. She refused, so they had to rely on anesthesia to bring her to sleep. And so eventually they actually found out that it was fake. So this shocked the public, and pressed by Li Du for why she faked her sex change, Yao explained that she wanted, the reason was that she wanted to reconnect with her father in the army. And so she was quickly forgiven by Li Du. For me, what is really important about Yao Jinping's case was that, before Yao's case, Chinese writers had always entertained the possibility of sex change, right? Like I said, but they talked about it as a case of anomaly. Whether it was the sex change experiments conducted on animals coming from the West, or whether it's the sex change of eunuchs or hermaphrodites, they never really entertained the idea that non-intersexed adults could also undergo sex transformation. But Yao Jinping's case really opened up that possibility, that really transformed and called people's attention to this awareness that humans, non-intersex humans, can also change their sex. What is really, so in the paper that I pre-circulated, I wanted to give you guys a sense of the different register of sources that I'm looking at. And so what the story that I just presented was the story presented in the mainstream press. In my research, I also look into the tabloid press's account of Yao Jinping's case. And I think it's actually really interesting because it offers us a kind of insight about how people were talking about this on a more informal level, as a sense of gossip, as a sense of kind of quotidian notions of the possibility for changing sex. And what was interesting for me, what I discovered, was that throughout the 1930s, when people were talking about Yao Jinping's case, they never looked at her as kind of like a monster. They never really kind of abhorred the notion that Yao wanted to change her sex. In fact, they're really sympathetic to this idea. And time and again, they suggested that before the physical exam, that Yao's sex change case could in some ways present valuable data for biomedical research. So that was really striking to me about the level of sympathy that you observe in the tabloid presses. So when the boundary of sex no longer looked as solid and rigid as they once had been considered to be, the Chinese-speaking communities actually met or discovered their first Chinese transsexual in 1950s Taiwan. So this is my final example, the case of Xie Jianshun. So Xie actually came to Taiwan with the Nationalist Army in 1949. She lost both of her parents by the age of 18. And in the summer of 1953, because of regular cramps that she could no longer kind of bear any longer, she came to the 518 Tainan Hospital for a checkup. And that is where the head of the external medicine department, Dr. Lin Chengyi, discovered that Xie actually had intersexed, what he considered as an intersexed condition, and initiated a series of sex change operations. So it's really interesting because, as some of you may know, this is actually, the 1950s is a context in which sex reassignment surgeries gradually transformed from being a basis for managing intersexuality into a new basis of psychosexual subjectivity. Even though Xie actually resisted time and again of the surgeon's attempt to change his sex into her, her physicians in charge continued to insist that what they're doing was sexually transforming Xie Jianshun's body. In addition to the kind of mainstream, by the way, this was really striking for me because just thinking about the historical context of 1950s Taiwan, in the nationalist government in Taiwan was as rigid and highly censored as the Maoist government on mainland China. So it was quite surprising to see such an abundant reportings of not just Xie's case, but other cases of sex change and gender transgression in the wake of Xie Jianshun's story. So that was kind of surprising to me. What was even more interesting was that throughout the media reports of Xie Jianshun's case, Xie was often referred to as the Chinese Christine. So why was he called the Chinese Christine? Because it was a direct reference to the American transsexual celebrity, Christine Jorgensen, who grabbed newspaper headlines the year before when she came back from her sex reassignment surgery done in Denmark. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of Jorgensen's story, but Jorgensen was really the person who made not just sex reassignment surgeries, but really the idea of transsexuality a kind of a mainstay in the popular imagination. And so you see that the Chinese Christine story adds a slightly more global and transnational dimension to this history of transsexuality. So several other scholars have written about the history of Jorgensen's story, most notably Joanne Meyerowitz, and the story of the Chinese Christine kind of plays off of that narrative. The Chinese Christine metaphor, because from that point onward, Xie Zhenshun was constantly referred to as the Chinese Christine, shows the influence of American culture on the Republic of China at the peak of Cold War. So what I'm suggesting here is that if we begin with the late 19th century kind of China's segment of Asia stereotype, now we're starting to enter into a new geopolitical formation of Cold War in Asia. So there's a very specific historical reason why it was in Taiwan, why it was in the 1950s that we came across Chinese transsexuality. So here are more photographs of Xie Zhenshun that came out in the 1950s. I believe by the late 1950s, by the late 1950s, after 1956, 57, really, Xie Zhenshun's name has, completely disappeared from the Taiwanese press. So that was a really kind of interesting moment, an early moment of transsexuality being popularized as a household term. Xie knew that everyone compared her to Christine Jorgensen in the United States, but she never really considered herself as a duplicate of Jorgensen. She knew that her story drew attention to the issue of medical technology, whether it can change sex. It drew to the issue of what is acceptable, normative expressions of gender and sexuality. Her story drew attention to the role of Taiwan as kind of situated on the margins of both the Sinosphere and the Anglosphere. Her story made it possible to articulate a version of transsexuality that is different from the American Western version. There's these consistent comparisons, but she never really considered herself as merely a double of Christine Jorgensen. So this kind of case study really allows me to kind of tap into those larger issues surrounding her case. It is also true.
Just clarification.
Sure.
He said she wasn't interested, or he wasn't interested in undergoing this sort of transformation.
Initially, yes.
But then he consented.
Yes. Eventually, he consented because I think also due to her body conditions, in order to be right. So he was discovered to be intersex according to doctors, and after detecting both ovarian and testicular tissues in her gonads, the doctors decided that it was more straightforward to convert Xie into a woman. And so he actually was very, very reluctant initially to undergo section, to become a woman.
Did he consider himself a woman after that?
Afterward,
He did?
I think eventually after 9 surgeries, Xie Zhenshun did adopt a more feminine persona. I think even by the 4th or 5th surgery, there was that sense already. But initially, he was really reluctant. The doctors even tried to get a sense of Xie Zhenshun's psychological sense of gender. So for instance, they sent a group of nurses to socialize with Xie Zhenshun to just get a sense of what Xie might feel after the surgeries. And so they were actually quite worried because initially Xie even expressed intentions of committing suicide possibly if he was converted into a she. But eventually, she did reluctantly agree to not just the following surgical operations, but also being relocated from Tainan to Taipei for the remaining surgeries. So that's kind of a difference too, I think, between Xie Zhenren's story and Jorgensen's famous story of transsexuality, because as we know, Jorgensen really capitalized on her fame, on her self-presented kind of glamorous looks. Jorgensen wanted to be a superstar, and she did become a celebrity. Jorgensen made her own films. Her own biographies was transformed into a film biography of herself. So that's really a difference between Jorgensen's kind of self-presentation of a glamorous feminine appearance with Xie Zhenren's initial desire to remain kind of heterosexual, masculine soldier of the Republican state. So that was a really interesting point of difference. So kind of moving onward, what was interesting is that after Xie Zhenren's story broke, it really opened the floodgate. Throughout the 1950s, I came across many stories of sex change, intersexuality, atypical conditions of the body, and gender transgressive behaviors. And all of these stories, time again, they begin by saying that in the wake of the Chinese Christine story, we have found another case of sex change. We have found another case of intersexuality. We have found another case of transvestism, so on and so forth. So really, the Xie Zhenren story kind of anchored the broader shifts in understandings of gender and sexual transformation. So Liu Jingde was one of these cases that was discovered in Taipei. There are other cases, famous cases. Zheng Qiuhuang was another really famous case that actually went through a long period of time and came to public attention more than 3 or 4 times. But what I'm suggesting here is that we can really understand why these stories came about by tracing kind of them back to the origins of Xie Zhenren's story and reporting. So Xie Zhenren's saga and other sex change reports that came up in the Taiwanese press, I will argue, kind of exemplifies the emergence of transsexuality as a modern form of sexual embodiment in Chinese-speaking society. I want to come back to this in the conclusion in just a minute, but I want to suggest that this genealogy that I'm tracing from Republican Chinese understandings of sex and sex change to post-war Taiwanese transsexuality, this is a genealogy that really supersedes a kind of conventional notion of post-colonial Taiwan. Because usually when we do Taiwanese history, we do a vertical history, right? Tracing it back to the period of Japanese post-colonial period and onto the nationalist government and to the contemporary Taiwanese nativism. But this genealogy kind of subverts that. And so it shows that the Republican government kind of regained sovereignty in Taiwan beyond a monolithic framing of Japanese post-colonialism. All in all, I think what is clear here is that there are two main factors that drove this kind of historical story, right? One is the quick technology transfer of Western medicine in specific parts of the Sinosphere. But second of all, is the way in which these places tends to be much more open in terms of the social cultural space that was articulated and enabled in the 1950s. It's a combination of these two factors that allow the wide media sensationalism to be showered on Xie Zhenren and sex change stories. Okay, so I want to conclude my talk by kind of situating this genealogy of sex change in this broader historiographical framework that I've borrowed from the literary scholar Suzhume called the Sinophone. So the Sinophone sounds awfully similar to Anglophone or Francophone. And so right there off the start, you can see that this is a contested political and historical relationship between the Sinophone world and China, just like the relationship between the Anglophone world and Britain, or the Francophone world and France. Sinophone refers to Chinese-speaking communities and cultures outside of China, or on the margins of China and Chineseness. And I've been using the Xie Jinping's case to exemplify the emergence of Sinophone societies in post-war Taiwan. This is a map of the Sinophone world that I have taken from, I believe it's actually Wikipedia. So someone's invested enough to draw up a map of the Sinophone world for us. Now, any historian looking at this map will find it problematic, right? So, for instance, it doesn't show change over time. The degree of blueness supposed to suggest the degree of Sinophoneness, I guess the intensity of Chinese-speaking cultures and communities. But in addition to change over time, we also don't see patterns of migration that made up this Sinophone world. And as I'm sure we're all familiar with, that patterns of migrations changes over time as well. But this is just to give a kind of global scope, a kind of an imagination of where we're ending up in this narrative that I'm telling, right? It's very different, right, from the segment of Asia where we begin. And I'm tracing this history through a very seemingly marginal phenomenon, sex change. Okay, so I think we can only understand Xie Jinping's transsexual history by situating it in terms of Sinophone production. Because, I believe that when we're getting to the 1950s, the story of Xie Jinping, actually, it relies on historical parallels outside of China proper, right? We're looking at convergence of several things: Japanese post-colonialism, American neo-imperialism, how Republican states became recontextualized in Taiwan, in the island of Taiwan, and also Taiwan's connection to other subregions of Cold East Asia. So in some ways, we're starting to see the communist, anti-communist divide that emerges in this context. And as we know, the two China's divide is not only a phenomenal, exceptional case. There's also the two Koreas, the legacy of which we're still living with today. So this is really the historical origins of that. Okay, so there's four things I want to point out that I believe putting the Xie Jinping's case in the framework of Sinophone production allows us to move kind of forward historiographically. First of all, this is not just a story about the West, right? This is no longer a story about Western influence. We're starting to see how Sinophone regions play an agency, an agential role in the formation of queer subcultures. So in post-colonial historiography, people like Naoki Sakai, Chakrabarty have offered ways to kind of deconstruct or de-universalize the West, right? This is what Chakrabarty calls provincializing Europe. I believe looking at Xie Jinping's case as a Sinophone production allows us to move away from that obsession with the West, right? We're no longer looking at the influence of West, but really from denaturalizing the West to also provincializing China, Asia, and the rest. So going beyond the West, beyond the kind of familiar, treating the West as an intimate enemy, it also allows us to kind of provincialize China. I think inherent in my discussion so far, I've tried to raise a series of implicit questions that in some ways continue to haunt a China-centered perspective. Was Xie Jinping's transsexuality Chinese or American in nature? Transsexuality in whose sense of the term? Was it a foreign import, an expression and internalization of Western imperialism, or a long-standing indigenous practice in a new light? How can we take the nationalist government's relocation in the 1940s seriously, right? Was it simply an example of migration, immigration, settler colonialism, or in the more fashionable word of the day, diaspora? Actually, I've been suggesting that neither of them helps us to concretely understand the Taiwanese context in the 1950s because there's no precedent or analogous situation, and historians have not actually paid sufficient attention to that. Thirdly, by looking at Xie Zhenshen's case as an example of Sinophone production, I'm also trying to put forward a more robust understanding of transnationalism. And this is the notion of minor transnationalism that I'm borrowing from Francois Leonet and Shi Shumei. So minor transnationalism suggests that the connectivity between certain regions, minor regions on the world map, they are significant, but they don't always have to be routed through a center, whether it's the West or Japan or China, right? So now when we're starting to entertain the possibility of minor transnationalism between places such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, so on and so forth, we're starting to giving these minor places its due, right? Its due credit. And it allows us to think about a history of sex change, not as simply a history of transsexuals coming out. What I'm suggesting here is that we're witnessing a history of transnational China from biopolitics in major transnational China, right? That's from the global perception of China's lacking to the emergence of a minor transnational China. It is through these geopolitical and biopolitical shifts that we can understand why transsexuality emerged as a sense of sexual subjectivity in the 1950s. And it is not because transsexuals are finally coming out. So it's a new kind of a different framework of getting at that sense of queer subcultural history. And finally, I think one of the most interesting finding and discoveries that I've made in this project is that the Sinophone framework allows us to come to terms with a new historical situation in the post-World War II period. What I'm referring to is the rise of what I call Sinophone modernity that really start to challenge and exceed the older framework of colonial modernity that had haunted East Asian history for a long time. And just to think about where I began. I began with the translation of the idea of Xing through Japan. So that's where colonial modernity is very helpful, right? We see how Japan, as an agent of colonial modernity, actually mediated not just linguistic, conceptual, and epistemological shift. But what I'm suggesting here is that by the time we get to the second half of the 20th century, Sinophone communities start to replace these earlier agents of colonial modernity, right? The Xie Zhenshen story points to an early moment of historical displacement. That is when non-normative genders and sexuality were rerouted through and rerouted in Sinophone communities on the periphery of China and Chineseness. So this transition from colonial to Sinophone modernity is something that we're only beginning to appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Questions? Perhaps I could begin with a very short question. You seem to focus your case on something that seems to be quite atypical, because it's more within the tradition of, let's say, freaks of nature, talking in Western terms, than in the tradition of men or women rediscovering the true sexual gender identity. As you said, I mean, Shi does not want to become a woman. He has to sort of, well, either convinced or forced into becoming a woman. In what way do you think does this shake ideas about masculinity and femininity? It seems that, here's a case where, there are problems with his biology, which we, as doctors, allow ourselves to fix, no matter whether he wants it or does not want it. Is the new idea of transgender or transgender people really a continuation of that? And in what way? Does this lead the way to this type of modern or sort of late 90s transgender idea or queer theory? Or is it something entirely different?
Yeah, I think one of the very interesting ironies of the case of Xie Zhenshun, but also not just Xie's case, but also in the case of Jorgensen as well, is how when the idea of transsexuality was put forward, was brought to public spotlight, it simultaneously, in some ways, reinforced certain kind of traditional notions of masculinity and femininity. So if we go back to Jorgensen's case for a moment, for instance, Jorgensen was really clear about her self-presentation of her kind of blonde, beauty, feminine look.
He or
And
she wanted to be a woman.
yes, so an argument can be made there that she was in fact bolstering a new kind of urban, white, middle-class femininity. And so that actually kind of goes hand in hand with the kind of resurgence of conventional stereotypes of masculinity and femininity in the post-war period. So I definitely think an argument can be made there in that regard. And Xia's case, like I said, there's a slight departure in the sense that initially he didn't really want to become transformed into the opposite sex. But after third or fourth surgery, he actually conceded to doing that. Yeah, I mean, and actually he went through 9 surgeries in total, 9 brutal surgeries to become the opposite sex. So I think that not just signals a departure from the familiar narrative of transsexuality, but at the basis of this is the sense that, okay, so there's some sense of kind of malleability and mutability to what we consider as maleness and femaleness. And that we really calls attention to the possibilities bring forward by medical technology. So I think that this also speaks to an ongoing tension, I think, within the field of queer studies, right? The tension between whether trans theory and queer theory are same or different. Do they have the same agenda, or are they following a different path? So it definitely has contemporary resonances as well. I would think that from a slightly different perspective, the cases of transsexuality does allow us to question what we consider as rigid forms of maleness and femaleness. So for example, Judith Butler has written about gender performativity, and her example is how drag, right? By being able for male bodies to be able to perform femininity in such a successful way, it shows that gender, there's no originality to gender. That gender is always a copy of the copy. So that I think the same case can be made about transsexuality in the sense that if one can become either a man or woman and transform into either one, that it probably creates there's more kind of malleable space in between for people to think about their basis of gender identification. So that we're not.
If you talk about transgressors, the nice thing for them is that they can go either way. They can dress like women and they can go back to dressing like men. If you undergo an operation, it's one-way street. It's like Derrida's famous essay about circumcision. You can only perform this once. It doesn't go both ways. And what way do you think this type of sort of medical brutalism makes for more malleability? Is it more malleable? Or is it simply a way of sort of putting pressure, in this case, on someone who wants to be both and is forced to be something?
Yeah, I mean, I think a comparative angle might help as well. Just to think about what transsexuality might mean historically, right? So, for instance, Afsaneh Najmadi has written about the history of transsexuality in Iran. And in the Iranian case, it's also quite interesting because whereas sex reassignment surgeries are being legitimated, licensed, it's actually considered as a way a way out of homosexuality to some extent. So yes, I totally agree that there could be a force of medical brutalism, but it can also be a force of escape and a force of kind of allow us to reconsider ourselves as well. It's interesting because isn't this, if we situate this on a continuum with other body modification practices, some of the other body modification practices, cosmetic surgeries, actually do not require a psychiatrist or a psychologist licensing in order to proceed, right? So in some ways, the other side of this medical brutalism is that there's a more medical caution involved in this process.
I mean, nowadays.
Yeah, it continues to be so. That in Taiwan too, like in order to get a reassignment surgery, you actually need the certificates from 2 licensed mental health professionals. So there's a degree of precaution, involved in there that you don't get with other types of body modification practices, which is also one way, right? Whether you get implants in different parts of the body, how do you ensure that you won't regret? Do you see what I'm getting at? There's a different dimension. I think different dimensions to these medical procedures involved too. Now, so coming back to your kind of first question though, there is a sense of tension between what transgender activism is trying to fight for, and versus what intersex movement is trying to fight for, right? So, intersex movement doesn't want doctors to get involved in terms of determining their sex from birth, but transgender activists want to have the liberty of having doctors involved in the determination of gender presentation. But I would argue that both converge in a way in which the queer kind of resistance to social norm wants to get rid of unwanted medical kind of legitimation of one's own body. So there is, even despite these ironies, there is still some kind of basis for some kind of forming some queer resistance as a force of social movement.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have 2 questions. One,
Just to introduce Professor Asaf Goldschmidt is an expert in Chinese medicine and pre-modern age.
First I want to take you to the earlier part of your talk, and you said that there's very little documentation about castration, about eunuchs, about how they become eunuchs prior to the 19th century. And I wonder, why is it so? I mean, is it because the way that eunuchs were, or a different way that eunuchs were perceived in Chinese society, so the procedure was not that important because it wasn't a gender issue, rather it was a lineage issue. So eunuchs were castrated not because, as in the harem context, so they couldn't touch the women, but instead they were castrated so they wouldn't have any lineage, collegiality or dependence. They won't have any kids, so they will be faithful to the emperor and serve him correctly. So the question is, first, why wasn't any, or why there isn't much documentation about eunuchs and the castration surgery in earlier literature, and do you see or do you attribute the ongoing discussion in the 19th century to the introduction of modern anatomy into China? The second question has to do with the second part of your talk. You sort of portrayed an almost smooth integration of Western ideas about gender, about medicine, into the Chinese realm without any tension. And this, what I'm familiar with, that wasn't the case. There was a lot of tension, both within the traditional medical context and in general. Those ideas were not introduced flawlessly into the Chinese culture. So if you could elaborate a little bit more about this tension, about struggles, about other voices that contested this discussion, contested this knowledge, or adhered to the traditional knowledge, or tried to update traditional knowledge without accepting all this new Western knowledge. So these are 2 very different questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So the heart of your questions, in some ways, I think deals with medicine, and I don't know if you find it surprising, as I did, that castration operations were not performed by Chinese physicians, right? So that's kind of interesting because you're dealing with, sorry?
Who performed that?
Well, that's a question, right? Well, so we have some accounts of professional knifers. So they're called Jiang, professional knifers, performing these operations. We have not been able to verify their existence in the palace archives. So they were discussed in these Western accounts that I talked about, also by eunuchs themselves, but not in the archives. So it just raises an interesting question about how do we get what kind of sources we rely on, how do we get access to that? By the early 20th century, like I said, when eunuchs were reporting about themselves, they also talked about how either they could castrate themselves, or quite frequently their fathers do the castration, which is an interesting parallel, right? Again, with the homogendering of foot binding, it's women who bind the feet of women, and it's the fathers who perform.
This must be very late.
Yeah, so this is actually from the
prior to the Qing, that's definitely
by the fathers, right? Yeah, I'm not quite sure how prevalent that would be.
Many of those eunuchs came from either families who sold them as normal children, and then they were castrated, or even more common from prisoners of war. So,
Yes.
I mean,
So
the most famous eunuch of China, Admiral Jiang, he was a Muslim. He was a prisoner of war, and then he became an admiral. So the origin is different.
Right. Right. So this, where was I getting at?
I don't know why, and how did the West, China react to Western idea? Was it as smooth as you described?
Oh, right. So that's the second part of the story. So I want to finish with the first part of the question about why I think there's not such a strong textual. I mean, it may be that if the knifers were actually, if they're real, there's some kind of real existence to the knifers, it may be that their kind of modes of transmission of these castration knowledge is not necessarily through textual transmission, but through oral transmission, and it may be a kind of apprenticeship even. So there's probably that dimension to how the expertise associated with castration operations were passed down. But again, like what I said, it's interesting. When you're dealing with an issue as serious as blood loss, even potential death, this is not the realm in which Chinese physicians were engaged in.
I wasn't asking in the context of Chinese physicians. I was asking in the context of surgeries. And by the way, if you're talking about death, I wonder if there are any records of accidental death. And
Possibly.
Prosecution and trials.
Yeah, because a very important part of the castration operations that was discussed time and again is that after operation, they had to ensure that they insert a rod into the urinary channel so that you could ensure urination, smooth urination after the surgery. Because if the hole kind of closed up, then the person is kind of no longer can be saved. So that was a very important part of the whole rhetoric. Yeah, so I still have to think about why that was the case. But like I said, there is different explanation that we can surmise. I think it connects really well to your second question about the uptake of Western scientific and medical understandings of sex. And I'm sure as you're familiar with other people's work, such as Zhang Lei and Bridie Andrews, they have demonstrated actually throughout the late 19th century, early 20th century, there's a lot of resistance against the introduction of Western biomedicine. So there's definitely that. I think for my project, you can imagine a project on gender or sex transformation can go in a number of different directions. And there are other kind of well-known examples of gender transformation in traditional Chinese culture, such as the Peking Dan opera actors. So these are male actors playing female roles. But I wanted to limit the scope of my project to the transformation of bodily sex, of physical sex. That's how I kind of was able to delimit the scope of my project. So I think with that specific criteria that I've kind of, the parameters that I've mapped out for the project, one has to rely on specific kind of, a very specific kind of genealogy. So that's why there is if it's not an overemphasis, but there is an emphasis on the uptake of Western biomedical understandings of the body. I mean, it in part can be explained through that. I can think about other kind of biases of my project, right? So for instance, the project tends to be much more urban biased. It tends to be more focused on the Han Chinese. So there's different kind of limitations to the project, and I can definitely imagine how different Chinese populations throughout this course of history I'm looking at must have either reinterpreted or resisted Western conceptions of sex, gender, and sexuality from different viewpoints.
Well, I want to thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. And I'm asking this as someone who's really not from the field of working very modern European history. But I wonder, to what extent would you kind of push against the limits of your choice of using the French historical epistemology approach? Because it's an approach that stresses moments of rupture, and looking for discontinuities rather than continuities. And it struck me that at the starting point and at the end point of the argument, one would actually benefit from looking at traditions, both when you're looking at the etymology of words like Chiang, and when you're talking about Sinophone modernity, at the largest terms possible. I was really wondering to what extent we, considering things like Chinese literature, which really struck me as in early modern Chinese literature, you have novels which are considered to be at the same time very erotic and still very highly placed in the canon, like The Plum in the Golden Vase or The Carmel Prayer Mat. And I was wondering what do you do with the vocabulary of those things and how it is transformed into in the moment before the moment in which your etymology begins, and thinking about just the culture more broadly. It strikes me that at the lowest level, at the highest level of the argumentation, you can kind of like try to think against your methodological choice. Does it make sense that way? By bringing in back traditions, moments of rupture, not talking about the conditions that make it possible, but how there are continuities that feed into the materials.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. And as you can imagine, as someone who's following the French traditional historical epistemology, I've been thinking a lot about continuities and discontinuities. And perhaps I should also preface by saying that this question looms quite big in the historiography of sexuality after Foucault's work. And that's why I kind of pre-circulated a paper to suggest that there is some kind of framework that serves as a basis of kind of my analysis. And just the gist of it is this, right? Foucault famously, and Foucauldians, not just Foucault, claimed that the emergence of homosexual as a subject position in the late 19th century constituted a very important rupture in the history of sexuality, right? And so that's where you go from, for instance, sodomy to homosexuality, right? So you actually deals with different regimes of truthhood and conditions of truthhood, right? So that's why discontinuity is very important. But the reason why I said that I've been thinking about this time and again is because everyone who thinks about discontinuities know that discontinuities rely on certain points of continuity, right? What is it that serves as a point of comparison? In the case of Foucault, for instance, it's the notion of same-sex relation, right? That becomes the stable, continuous vector that allows him to make those kind of disruptor claims. So this is in some ways a different way of responding to your question, because I do think that the issue of, in fact, the polarity of continuity versus discontinuity, they must be on a kind of set of continuum. It's not just a complete opposite, So that's what I have in mind. Now, bring that question to bear on the project that I just presented, one of the sections that I skipped, remember the section on May 4th, sexology, that's actually a chapter that kind of borrows heavily from this Foucauldian genealogy of homosexuality, because what I argued there is that the May 4th discourse of sexology gave rise to this new notion of homosexuality. So you're right. In fact, in traditional Chinese, it's not literature, but I even call it pornographic literature, and Giovanni Vitiello has written about this. Pornographic literature, there's a lot of depictions of male same-sex desire, right? And male same-sex relations. And there's different ways that male same-sex relations were talked about. So for instance, there's the concept of P, which is translated as obsession. You see that obsession was used to describe a literati gentleman's preference. It's a symbol of their cultural refinement, right? And then when it served as a basis for translating this new notion of homosexuality in the early 20th century, you might call that a sense of continuity. But I will actually push back against that. And this is where I think historical epistemology is useful, because this equivalence between the traditional notion of P and the new understanding of homosexuality was made possible and meaningful only by the early 20th century when this new idea was introduced, right? So this equivalence had not always been there, but only established as a result of these early 20th century neologistic constructions. I hope that, I know it's a kind of complicated way of responding to this, but I do hope that it goes some way to show why the historical epistemological approach is useful for us to not to just apply later concept anachronistically to earlier periods, and just suggest that, these earlier pornographic Chinese literature also has depictions of homosexuality. No, they're not. Right? To say the very least, we across culture globally, we have abundance textual evidence of same-sex desire. But all of these historical evidence comes from a very biased standpoint. Social hierarchy is always implicated, right? So for instance, if we want to bring ourselves to the Ming period, the literary gentleman will be appalled if you say that his sexuality is the same as the kind of sexuality of his male favorites, right? Just to go some way to show that that's a different structure of sexual knowledge than what we mean by egalitarian notion, age egalitarian, hierarchical egalitarian notion of homosexuality emerged in the modern period.
Thank you. One last question. Yes, please. I have to be. Yes. Go ahead.
You presented, as you say, a genealogy of, say, medical manipulation that is applied to the sex organs, right? Whereas perhaps the genealogy of the gender performance in Chinese culture goes way back, right? We can trace it back to Chu tradition in the Han, to the Ci poetry in the Song, and of course to visual performances as well. Whereas in the genealogy that you presented, which seems separate, there is a great degree of coercion, right? I wonder, my question is, if and where these two meet, or probably when, right? When these two cultural, historical processes meet in particular case studies, or, I don't know, we heard two examples, and you mentioned later in the 50s other cases, but I'm not sure if there's also this degree of coercion, or whether that there we see a meeting between traditions of gender performance and the medical procedure.
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I haven't thought about these case studies in the light of kind of either collision or convergence between traditional gender performance examples versus the more kind of medical examples. And one of the reasons is this, actually, because there had also been, right, medical explanations of sexual ambiguity in the past. So that had been kind of my point of kind of reference to see how the modern biomedical understandings not just clashed with, but actually kind of absorbed these earlier medical understandings of sexual ambiguity. So one of the most famous systematically referenced example of medical discussions of sexual ambiguity is Li Shizhen's 本草纲目, in which it was a very famous Ming Dynasty Materia Medica that continues to be circulated today. And Li Shizhen's work is important because he outlined what he called 5 non-males and 5 non-females, right? And so it exemplifies the ways in which Chinese medical understandings of intersexuality, or what we might call hermaphroditism today, was articulated in a framework that is very, very different from the biomedical and anatomical framework. It was articulated in the sense that whether someone has the generational or reproductive capacity. So if you do not have reproductive capacity, you belong to either the 5 non-males and 5 non-males. I mean, so from my point of view, that seemed to be the kind of the anchor point from which later the stuff that I'm talking about, the biomedical understanding, start to challenge and exceed. So that has been kind of my core focus. But there are other kind of minor examples, I think what you're referring to, about traditional notion of gender performance that kind of becomes important and germane to the story I talk about. For example, the story of Yao Jinping that I talked about in the 1930s. Her story is actually quite reminiscent of Mulan's narrative, right? And in fact, if you look at the paper I pre-circulated in tabloid presses, actually some of the writers have consistently compared Yao Jinping to Mulan. And so there is certainly traditional notions of desire to transgress gender boundaries. And this is in a very specific way, right? This is the female to male transformation direction. And Charlotte Firth has written about this. Her focus on the 16th century Ming Dynasty cases of sex change. And she talks about this, right? She says, okay, so sex transformation happened, but it was uneven. So female to male transformation was much more accepted than the other way around. So even though on the surface, these are both cases of sex transformation, but lurking in the background is, again, this kind of Confucian patriarchal notion of gender performance. So I think it's actually very relevant to what I'm suggesting here. And just to wrap up my response, there's one final example. I think there's a sense of rupture between these earlier traditional understanding of gender performance and these later modern scientific and biomedical understandings, because a lot of the literature that I was looking at in the 1930s, when the Chinese sexologists were trying to recast earlier understandings of eunuchs or gender transgressive behavior or intersexuality in the new language of biology and biomedicine, what they're also pushing for is the ethos of scientism that came to dominate the Republican period. So what they're saying is that these earlier notions of gender transgression or performance, they're ungrounded, they are instances of superstition, and it's modern biology that can help us throw light on things that were less previously well understood. So sex change became a very important hallmark in this regard. People were confused about why is it possible for humans to change their sex. And these sexologists were saying that, well, it's nothing too surprising. As long as you understand the anatomical constructions of the human body, as long as you understand that there are natural phenomena such as intersexuality and that sex change can happen among intersex individuals, then there's nothing surprising or odd or freakish about these examples. But science gives the power to throw light on these examples. So that's another instance where I think that earlier notions of gender performance can kind of coincide or kind of collide with these new scientific understandings. In fact, I would argue that these new scientific understandings are trying to dismiss earlier notions as more superstitious and unfounded. So, in the aftermath of Yao Jinping's stories, there are other stories of sex change that try to use earlier like Mulan narrative to explain, and these sexologists really push back against those and suggesting that they don't provide us a rational basis for understanding these things.
Thank you very much. This was very illuminating.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the rest of this.
Thank you.